podcasting in person is different because you start looking at people. So that's something else to think about. It's just to
So if I talk to anybody, I will be rotating around the microphone so that the microphone is always it's in front of my mouth.
More or less. Yes.
But I won't get this close to it if I can possibly help it, except when it comes to the sultry sounds of cost-benefit analysis, or as the French call it, benefit-cost analysis.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined today by my two co-hosts, but not as always, in person, in the studio, such as it is. We're surrounded by blankets, but that's okay. The exceptional Alison Reeve. Hello, Alison.
Hello, Luke. It's lovely to be here with you in the blanket fort.
And a man freshly invigorated by 3 full days at the PAX Australia Gaming Convention, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Yes, I've had a mature and financially sensible long weekend. Bargains have been won, and a lot of interesting games and panels and issues in gaming have been experienced.
I know that we have recently been exploring the benefits of narrative-based scenarios to sort of prepare ourselves for things that might come up in our futures. I was trying to imagine, Tennant, what you would do if the PAX Australia Gaming Convention was co-scheduled with COP somewhere around the world. What would your decision-making process be?
That would be a dark time. I think I would have to choose COP.
Perhaps if Australia hosts a COP, you could get like a PAX side event at the COP.
I think I will leave that one up to the good people at Penny Arcade and Reed Pop Exhibitions. Sponsor slot not on offer at this time.
Could be the ultimate Tennant Reid crossover event. On this week's show, we take a look at a report that unpacks a major shift in the Biden administration's approach to cost-benefit analysis and what it might mean for climate policy. But first, the IEA has released the 2023 update to its net zero roadmap, which it describes as a global pathway to keep the goal of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees within reach. The first edition of this report made quite the splash back in 2021, becoming the IEA's most downloaded publication ever. Alison, what stood out to you in this update?
This is so exciting because it was my favourite report of 2021 and also the one that I downloaded like so many times because I could never remember where I saved the giant PDF that it was.
So how many of the IA's downloads was just you?
I'd have to check, but at least one a month for about 18 months, I would say. Look, I think it's really great that they've updated this because the world has actually changed a huge amount since 2021. The major points here is, well, it's not really a surprise to anyone that we still aren't going fast enough, but tech has got better. There are more things that are on the table now than there were in 2021, so that's really positive. One of the things that was, I thought, really quite cool is that if you take the existing and announced solar and battery manufacturing capacity, we are just about in line for 1.5 degrees for 2030, or where those need to be, which really does show what you can do if you pull your finger out and you've got a nice, modular, easily replicable technology with a fast learning rate.
Yep.
There is also, I think, they just reiterated the message that was there in 2021, that if you're on a 1.5 degree path, you do not need to invest in new coal or oil or gas fields. They've got LNG trade falling by 60% across 2020 to 2050 and the Asia Pacific peaking before 2030. So that's us, that's Australia. There were a couple of bits I thought were a bit retro, I don't know, where I thought the world had changed and they don't seem to have. They still seem to be forecasting large volumes of hydrogen being traded as hydrogen between countries. And I feel like the rest of the world is moving on a bit from that and talking more about energy-intensive products which are easier to move around and you just make them with the hydrogen. They also had an increased role for DAX. I don't remember seeing much DAX at all in the 2021 report, and that's there now as a fair chunk of the CCS stack.
Their pants were much higher, so you couldn't see that. That's direct air capture, carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. But they are still forecasting a lot of CCS on power stations, which feels very 2010. I would like to know where these power stations are and who's actually going to do them.
And I think that's mostly on gas-fired power stations. I think there's very little coal CCS in their model. But, yeah, gas still has a role in their model in the power system for a long time, but almost all of it by 2050 with CCS, which maybe Australia's former chief scientist Alan Finkel had an op-ed in the Financial Review just last week as we record, saying let's say no to nuclear and yes to 10% gas in the electricity system.
Sensible man. I think the other thing, which I guess is quite pertinent, is they did say that developed countries should be looking to hit net zero by 2045, not 2050.
So there aren't that many that have made that commitment. I think Germany, and is there anyone
Norway,
else?
I
Maybe
think.
Norway?
Yeah.
A couple of European countries. So that's a long way from where the debate is in most developed countries.
Yeah.
Victoria has committed to that.
Oh, there you go.
The country of Victoria. I'm so glad they let me through passport control.
One of the leading nations of our world.
I was reflecting on why this report is so popular, and it strikes me that IEA has a certain amount of authority. It's not an uncontroversial institution. It's not beloved by all, but it's kind of independent, has a lot of buy-in from a lot of different countries, and so it carries the weight of some authority. And the core message in these reports is an incredibly sort of optimistic one. It's like, we can do this. Like, the pathway is narrowed, and they acknowledge that in the preamble to this report. Like, we haven't done quite as much as we probably should over the last couple of years, but there remains a narrow path to 1.5. And the things that we need to deploy now to keep the hope alive are currently available technologies. And the messages, like the headline messages, it's a little bit like the sequel that replays, the beats of the previous movie. They're kind of the same, right? It's like tripling the installed capacity of renewables by 2030. It's doubling the rate of energy intensity improvement, so making sure we're extracting all the value that we can from energy efficiency. And then the ramp up of electrification of transport and low temperature heat, so EVs and heat pumps, again, kind of modular technologies that you can, with the right policy and the right incentives, kind of ramp up really quickly if you want to. So, keeping the dream alive, our friend Fatty.
It was interesting, though, on that stuff around buildings and transport and industry, though. They did a sort of an estimate in there of the stuff that relies on behaviour change.
Yep.
And they actually put a number against it of like, here's the extra that you would need to spend on low carbon electricity and hydrogen if you don't get the behaviour change.
Yes.
And it's a very large number. It's $4 trillion US.
Which I think is really helpful, right?
Yes, because it does make that much more of an apparent trade-off, I
Yes.
think, particularly for politicians who are like, I don't want to have to ask people to do anything. It's like, okay, you just need to pop $4 trillion in the savings account then. Your choice.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to add just a couple more points, which is that it's not just developed countries bringing forward ambitions that's required for the pathway in this. You need to have major emerging economies substantially accelerate their ambitions as well. China needs to, on this scenario, needs to peak their emissions as soon as possible and hit net zero more like 2050 rather than the 2060 that's currently their plan. India needs to make some very substantial further progress beyond that they've committed so far to very large, ambitious targets for adding renewables, but not so much for the haste of emissions reduction. And so there's some challenging goals involved here. They call, also challenging in different ways, on advanced economies to provide a lot more capital to help developing countries do the deployment of renewables and clean energy in their own economies, where typically they have a much higher cost of capital and greater difficulty accessing that. And these are extremely capital intensive, very low labour intensity technologies. And I think we also have to say, while there are tremendously important and exciting things happening in the clean technology deployment side of things, the fossil development and deployment side of things, most countries, the vast majority of countries' policies and current outlooks are incompatible with what's suggested in the 1.5 scenario. Whether that is the large emerging economies that are, like China's still adding coal generation capacity. It's not being utilised very much, but they're still adding it. India's coal minister is saying the sorts of things you'd expect a coal minister to say about how important coal is. But also the United States under Joe Biden is producing more oil than it has ever produced before and plans to produce more. And there'll be a competition at the forthcoming election between who can be said to be
oilier.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to speculate.
Well, I think in terms of personality type, it's pretty clear who's oilier. But in terms of economic outcome,
I think there may be a correlation there.
Biden has delivered more oil production.
Correlation, not causation.
Yes. In any event, we've got, I think, a few more iterations of the IEA pathway in front of us where some things will be overperforming, and we better hope they do, because some things are certainly going to be underperforming, and before they converge, reality and hope.
Shall we chat about a report?
I couldn't be more excited about cost-benefit analysis.
Cost-benefit analysis is a mainstay of public policy making around the world. It has the goal of weighing the costs and benefits of a regulation or funding decision and ensuring that actions taken by government deliver a net benefit for society. While commonplace, it is also controversial, with critics pointing out that traditional approaches to cost-benefit analysis tend to exclude a range of crucial factors. This can lead to policy decisions that stack up in a spreadsheet, but make little sense in real life. And with policy action on climate mitigation and adaptation ramping up around the world, how we approach cost-benefit analysis can have big implications for climate policy. It is a thorny topic all round, and one which is taken on with gusto in a new draft paper titled Efficiency versus Welfare in Benefit Cost Analysis, the Case of Government Funding. In it, the authors take a look at an update to the Biden administration's guidance for assessing funding decisions, which shifts the focus of cost-benefit exercises from efficiency to welfare. Tennant, what did you make of it?
So, this might be, I think, the clear leader in what will sound at first blush like most boring, least relevant, most nerdy paper we've ever covered.
I'm sorry, I fell asleep.
Yeah. Why on earth should you, dear listener, care about the fate or otherwise of Office of Management and Budget Circular A94, last updated 1993, now in the process of being updated by the Biden administration? And the reason is that there's some really major issues buried in how cost-benefit analysis has been done in the US, and very similar issues in how it's done in Australia. And there are some exciting, but maybe also having their own complexities and problems, approaches to really deeply reforming that are underway in America. They are the subject of controversy there. And so this paper that we're focusing on is a riposte and a rejoinder to some criticisms that are being made of the changes, and also proposing some things for regulators to and analysts to look out for in pursuing this path themselves. So we should say a little bit about what the status quo is and what this new hotness is, and who are these people who've written the paper. Zachary Liskow and Cass Sunstein are, if your ears are tingling with excitement at those names, then you, dear listener, are a nerd. But so are we. So on we go. Zachary Liskow was recently running the process of updating the Biden administration's Office of Management and Budget directive for how cost-benefit analysis should be done. And Cass Sunstein is a long-time legal academic and regulatory theorist, and was a big wheel in regulatory policy in the Obama administration. And he also wrote
Nudge,
which was...
so this is a book he wrote with another guy called Richard Thaler. And I think if your ears pricked at Cass Sunstein, you're potentially not a nerd. You're just potentially someone who frequents airport bookshops, because it was quite popular as an idea.
It's true. It's true. It wasn't quite Da Vinci Code popular.
No, but along with all of those other management.
It's like the hot ideas that kind of take over the world for about 12 months. And then,
that's right. That was the book, I think, that really brought behavioural economics and behavioural theory into public policy. If you've had one of those letters from the tax office that says, you haven't paid your tax yet, Luke, do you know that X number of people in your postcode pay their tax on time? You've been nudged. So, nudge theory was big in the US. David Cameron set up a whole nudge unit. Australia had this whole behavioural unit, which I think is still there in Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. It found its way into a lot of state-based policies. It found its way into robo-debt. But Cass Sunstein was one of the people who really crystallised a lot of those ideas and showed how they could apply in public policy. So, in some ways, going to Tennant's question about why should you care about some obscure circular and government policy in the US, it's because we tend to get a lot of our public policy ideas through either the UK or the US. So the stuff that comes up in this paper, it will sure as hell come up in the Australian debate at some point.
Yep. And whatever the next hotness is, maybe a public policy design book called Wink. We'll be sure to apply it. All right. Okay. So the status quo in the US has been that the practice of benefit cost analysis is highly specialised, and there's a society for benefit cost analysis, and we'll hear more from them later. There are requirements that benefit cost analysis be done both on regulatory decisions of the federal government and of some state governments, but also for some spending decisions. Not as many spending decisions as I would have thought. The authors of the paper note that Circular A94, which they're focusing on the reform of, applies to $40 to $50 billion a year of US government spending, which is like $40 to $50 billion US dollars is a lot of money to me, but the US government spent $6.27 trillion in 2022. So this is not the guide to all spending of the US government, but the current process requires that agency decision makers have reference to economic efficiency. There's some mention of other factors, but overwhelmingly what the directive requires them to consider is the economic costs and the economic benefits of whatever the proposed spending is in coming to a recommendation or a decision. Now, there are other factors referenced in there about equity and distributional impacts. And the authors of this paper say, and they would know, having been deeply involved in like the government end of regulatory decision-making for a long time, nothing has ever been done to actually get at, in a deep way, those issues in the decisions made around spending that's subject to these this form of cost-benefit analysis.
Despite the fact that it's explicitly called out in the old 894 circular that you need to think about these distributional effects. But there's also no guidance in this circular about how one might do that, and nobody's ever tried, as far as we can tell.
And because it's hard and they're not funded to. So, all right, enter the dragon. No, enter a new regulatory broom.
Can I pause you there? Because before the appearance of the new broom,
maximum tension. Okay,
I think it might not be crazy to kind of give a little airtime to their 4 stylized cases.
Good call,
right? Because this paper really hinges on how the old approach to cost-benefit analysis and the new approach of cost-benefit analysis would play out in these types of scenarios. So they present right up the front of the paper these 4 stylised cases. The first one is a wealthy community that is facing flood risks. And again, this is focused on spending decisions. So the authors are imagining communities that are applying for grant funding. And I guess this is the climate relevant bit of this, the adaptation relevant bit of this, because there's a certain amount of money to spend on adaptation. Where do we spend it? That's the question that they're reflecting on. The community's seeking $40 million for funding for a levy. So that's your cost. The value associated with that expenditure is quite high. The benefits are quite high because of the high property values in that well-to-do community. And so that passes a traditional cost-benefit analysis that is weighing the costs and the benefits, flies through, money gets spent. And then the 3 other stylised cases, 2, 3 and 4, are looking at a poor community with a variety of risks. Case 2, very, very similar. It's a poor community facing wildfire risks. They want to spend some money to reduce the risks associated of wildfire. Again, it costs $40 million. But because of low property values, the cost-benefit analysis doesn't weigh up because the cost of the buildings that are being saved doesn't meet that $40 million threshold. Scenario 3, it's funding to reduce mortality and morbidity associated with risks of extreme heat. The benefits are slightly lower than the costs, and it doesn't get across the line. And then there's a 4th scenario, again a poor community. The cost again $40 million, but there's no information on the benefits. Doesn't get across the line. I think the point that they're very clearly making is that it is a lot harder to get this type of spending across the line in poor communities. And what they're shining a spotlight on is this has led to the federal government spending more money more regularly on these sorts of investments in well-to-do communities. And that seems a bit crazy.
Yeah. And there's been specific discourse and congressional hearings about the Federal Emergency Management Agency's history and practices and how it's frequently wealthy communities and not poor communities that get the most emergency assistance and pre-assistance to deal with the very real challenges that lots of communities face in the US. So the status quo is not so great.
Back to the broom.
All right. Well, so the new regulatory czars in the US, including Richard Ravesh, who we've talked about previously, are reforming a whole lot of elements of how regulations are formulated and tested. And one of the things that they're doing is applying a lot of economic analysis and discourse and improvement and criticism and argument that's taken place over the years since 1993 when this particular circular was last redrafted. Now, one of the things that's brought to the surface by these authors is that there are ideas buried in the history of regulatory analysis in the US. It's become a sort of a mechanical process where you just you take this approach because that's the approach that we've taken for decades. But if you go back to the original documents, they do try and justify themselves in ways, including with the idea that the point of the focus on efficiency is it's a situation is efficient if the winners from a decision could win so much that they could afford to compensate the losers and still be better off.
Not that they ever do.
Well, that's the thing.
The point is that never happens.
Never. And it's not clear that there's any mechanism by which it could happen in the case of the spending agency decisions that are the subject of this particular regulation. Nobody's going off and saying, well, your houses
your property values went up, so when you sell, you have to give some money to these poor guys over here who have been inundated by floods.
Yes.
I mean, I had a slight issue with that thing because I'm kind of like, well, technically an efficient tax system does all of this.
Yes.
And not to jump right to head, but right at the end of the paper, they do kind of make the point of sort of, and I'm paraphrasing mightily, like an efficient tax system kind of seems out of reach, and so we have to do these things through other means.
Yeah.
We're not prepared to touch our tax system and actually make it fair.
And in the context of the US polity, like that might be a realistic judgment.
Yeah.
But, we should be keeping in mind throughout this, and when we think about how to apply the next thing, the exciting thing we're going to talk about, which is what they're doing, we do need to consider that we have, in Australia, a different environment, a different polity, a different set of options in front of us, and maybe we can do better. Certainly we can do different. But the new hotness, the thing you've been waiting for, dear listener.
Lean into the mic now.
All right. So the thing that they're doing in new, improved, neo-circular A94 is that they are going to scale the costs and benefits, but especially the benefits of proposed spending in relation to the marginal utility of consumption for the communities that benefit. And having just said that, you may be wondering, why on earth is that controversial, new or sexy? What they're doing is acting on the insight that a marginal dollar, an extra dollar of income or $1 less income is worth a lot more to a person with not many dollars to their name than it is to a person with bazillions of dollars. The extra difference in your life that dollar can make is a lot more if you are getting by on minimum wage in a community of low values for everything than if you are on Easy Street. And what they're proposing to do is to take that broad insight and convert it into a mathematical adjustment to the costs and benefits in the calculations, so that if an investment of the sort that is in the examples in a poor community might have a negative net benefit, but like a modestly negative net benefit on a traditional analysis because you're saving a bunch of homes, but they're not very valuable homes. On this weighted analysis might well show that it has a strong improvement, not to efficiency, but to welfare.
Yep.
So they're proposing reorienting cost-benefit analysis decisively around welfare, not just efficiency. And that's the sort of thing that has got a lot of people harumphing and clutching their pearls and any other indications of discomfort you might like because they're politicising benefit cost analysis, which has never been done before.
Okay, so
this is the fall from Eden.
Practically speaking, like in the rich community and the poor community, say a poor person in that poor community is $200,000 worth off because of an extreme weather event. That is disastrous. Like, you know, they're out on the street.
That's a couple of years of income.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And their ability to bounce back from that, draw on other resources to, you know, rebuild or move or whatever it is, that it's just not possible or plausible. If you're very rich and you suffer $200,000 worth of damage, it's not such a big deal, right? It's not that we shouldn't care about that, but if you've got finite resources and you're deploying them it seems like that is a consideration one should bring to bear to resource allocation. That's the premise of these authors.
See, I kind of wondered reading, a lot of the time when I was reading this, I was looking at it and going, but our system doesn't work that way. Like I sort of felt a lot like the Australian system has a lot of this already baked in.
Yep.
And some of it seems to come right back to what we think the role of government is, right? That the Australian system is very much that the government is there as the safety net that catches you if you can't help yourself. Whereas in the US, it's like the government is there as basically an ATM, where, money in, money out.
An ATM
and
with
also,
an army.
An ATM with an army, and also to be kept small enough to drown it in a metaphorical bathtub, right?
Yes. Not the army, though.
Not the army, though. A lot of bathtubs. And so in some ways I was kind of puzzled about why they were going into all of this detail, because to me this is like just the water that I swim in, it's just there. It's just how it is. And so that idea that you would have to actually come up with a mathematical formula felt a bit odd. And then I thought through it a bit more and thought, well, maybe what happens in the Australian system is we bake that stuff into the design. So we would not put ourselves in a situation where you had the rich community and the poor community competing with each other, duking it out to get the money.
Yeah.
We would sit back, like government policymakers would sit back and go, where are all the areas that need flood mitigation? Which are the ones that are most serious? How do we structure the rules around this spending such that the people who need it get the money?
It is a little bit like they've structured their grant program, like, people applying to build basketball courts or something around the country, right? Like the rollout of sports funding. I think that's really true, and it's one of the characteristics that one needs to bear in mind about the American system versus the Australian system.
Exactly.
The other one that struck me is that, all of this focus on spending and the, and how money is spent is particularly relevant in the US context because they can't get any regulations through.
Well, they can, but can they make them stick? So the Obama administration did a bunch of regulatory proposals under of many sorts, but one major stream of that was the Clean Power Plan that the US EPA put forth.
Yep.
And then what happened to that? Well, first it went into the vortex zone of litigation, and some stuff that was important in it got put on hold, and then other stuff got knocked out, and then there was a chance for the EPA to go about off and have a think and put forward something different. But while they were in the process of doing that, the administration changed, and the new Trump administration said, we don't want a clean power plan, we want an American power plan, and it's going to do all kinds of great things to increase coal consumption because coal is more secure than gas. And that got frozen in the courts too. And then the Biden administration has come in and they're trying to do yet more different things that are sculpted to satisfy where the courts were a few years ago, and who knows where they may be next. And so that they're having a go.
Sure.
But I think the other thing is with spending in the US is not the same as spending here because they don't have cabinet government in the way that we do. So spending has to go through a spending bill and pass through Congress. But then once it's passed, it's like that money's there and you can spend it. Whereas with Australia, you pass a supply bill and then the government can spend up to the limit of that supply pretty much wherever it likes, which in this case would allow you to go, actually, I want that community to have some money and I'm going to move some money from over there to over here so that that community can have that money. Sometimes that's really great because it's got lots of flexibility, and other times that leads you to having car parks in marginal seats that weren't really needed.
So Lisko and Sunstein are focusing in this paper quite narrowly on the spending-related benefit-cost analysis. But they do note that a lot of the same issues apply to regulatory-based BCA. It's just simpler to think about these issues in the context of spending because you don't have any of the issues that come with a regulation may impose costs on the same people that it's intended to benefit. if you have, in their example, standards for a more efficient refrigerator, that will benefit people who use refrigerators, and it'll have a cost also for people who buy refrigerators. And how does all that play out and work out? Well, you can come to an answer, but it's a more complicated process than government gives me money for something. Does that have a direct cost to me? Not really.
Well, it has an opportunity cost.
It has an opportunity cost for the economy, but for me, beneficiary of it or not, if I fail to get it, it's a simpler question, they think, and that's why they've focused.
Yeah, I mean, I think it still can have an opportunity cost for you in this, if government spends money on a school, it can't spend that on a hospital, and both of those would have benefited you one way or the other.
I'm not sure that the current US budget evidences as strict an approach to if A, then not B, as that. It's like A through Z
like,
at the moment.
If A, then communism. If B, freedom.
Well, freedom's great, but I don't know. Sidebar, we've had a lot of discussion in this podcast, but also, a little bit of discussion out in the wider world about the US Inflation Reduction Act and new approaches to the end of neoliberalism or whatever. We can just spend what it takes to do what is needed. And they've got some difficult budget circumstances in the US. I think some major readjustment of revenue or spending or both is going to be needed there. So,
well, I think particularly when all of that money, or most of that money where you're actually spending it, is borrowed.
Yeah, at a cost that's increasing.
Exactly. And I mean, that wasn't really in this sort of paper, but that is also, it behoves you to spend it well if you're asking future generations to pay for that money.
Yes. Boy, this is the last bastion of neoliberalism here on the pod tonight.
Well, they do make the point that while they're obviously, the authors are in favour of elevating distributional considerations in the assessment of where to apply funding, they're not suggesting that one should throw efficiency entirely out.
No.
Right?
No.
Indeed, they're making the point that one should calibrate your approach to assessing those distributional impacts in such a way that efficiency is maintained in the broad. They also make the point that it's much, much better to have a formal process for calculating those distributional considerations rather than just eyeballing a community and going, oh, you don't seem very well off.
Yeah.
Indeed. Let's throw some money at you. Like, you need to maintain some rigour in the process, which goes back, I think, to the point that you were making earlier, Tennant. They are not anti-cost benefit analysis. They're like, let's fix it so that it's meeting our needs.
Mend it. Don't end it.
Indeed.
So I had some mixed feelings about this point of, and I think you do too, Alison, about this point of it's better to put some numbers around it and build welfare into the one number that goes into the decision process rather than have it be a thing off to the side. I think it absolutely is better to have it built into the one number than to have it be a thing off the side if the thing off the side is functionally just ignored, which seems to be the case in a lot of US decision-making, and not just the US. We do have an unhealthy collective relationship with flawed numbers where the number is the thing that a lot of people and processes, media, government, and consumers of media and government, somebody gives us a number with 5 asterisks on it and we ignore the asterisks and say that number is a powerful, potent thing. And so in that context, if you're not in the number, you're nowhere. So, okay, better to be in than out. But can we do better than that? We probably can do better than putting everything into one critically insufficient number.
Oh, I mean, having multiple criteria against which you make a decision and being clear about what all those criteria are would be one way to do it. Yeah, I mean, I had a huge amount of sympathy with the argument that, there are groups of people who will benefit more than others if this money is spent well, and that we should have something, that reflects that within the assessment process. But the idea that you bundle it all into one single number made me feel like there'd be an awful lot of stuff hiding in there. There'd be an awful lot of, like you say, 5 asterisks as, Appendix J assumptions, and also sounded a bit like a consultant's picnic to make all of this work.
Where do you draw the boundaries?
Anyone who's ever done a cost-benefit analysis knows that whole boundary question becomes incredibly fraught. And also the whole question of, well, what would have happened anyway? And you're bringing more criteria into that. And so you're sort of adding, you're multiplying complexity by complexity. I think there's another school of thought that would just say, well, just do a straight benefit and cost analysis. And then if you want to add the welfare overlay, you add that in another way. And again, that is something that you could do within the Australian system because, that's where you can imagine, an agency would look at a bunch of benefit cost analysis and present the minister with a list of things like these are all the ones that passed it. And then the minister would say, yeah, but these guys missed out. And I'm going to exercise my ministerial discretion and also award them a grant. And sometimes that, like I said before, sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. Whereas here, I think because the decision over the existence of the money has been made by Congress and is now being completely outsourced to bureaucrats with no democratic system over the top, they want to put some rules around welfare and what powers those bureaucrats are allowed to exercise with respect to welfare. And I could understand why you would do that if you've got no, that once the money's allocated, there's no democratic overlay over it at all. Yeah, so basically, I don't know.
I think if you're in that kind of world of econometric thinking, like it's unsurprising that they're coming up with another formula, right? Like, that formula is rubbish. I've got a better formula for you that's going to deal with all of this fuzzy stuff that we care about over on the left of politics.
When you are a hammer, everything looks like an inviting procession of nails just waiting to be slammed.
And there might be some just, practicalities around that because, going to the dashboard approach of having those multiple metrics, like actually could be really hard in the context because this isn't just a cost-benefit analysis approach for climate policy. This is supposed to be applied across the whole of government.
Yeah.
So to really do that properly, to do that approach that you're suggesting properly, one would need a multitude of approaches because you've got different boundaries, different considerations, different values that are being applied in all of these different contexts. I'm not defending. I actually agree with you, Alison. I think that would be much better, but I just...
I've sat, in my previous role being a public servant, I have sat on many grant assessment panels in my time, and it is really hard to decide who should get stuff and who doesn't. And there are so many things that, if you think about a set of grant guidelines, if you've ever looked at them, you have like compulsory criteria and then you have merit criteria. So that's like a way of saying, well, these things are kind of good, but they're not mandatory. And you have people who absolutely nail all the merit criteria and then like they're a bit wobbly on the mandatory criteria. So what do we do about them? And then like even coming up with your mandatory criteria in the design in the first place, you can never land just one thing that you're going to make the decision on. There's always 4 or 5 different things. And I think one point that they did make in here as well is that the more complicated you make these things, the more cost you impose on people to even apply for it.
Yes.
And I think they were sort of thinking if we do make this too hard, we're actually not doing poorer communities a service at all because we're making it even harder for them to access the money.
And so in their being slightly out from the centre of decision-making on this now, these 2 authors are urging that the resources are there for most of this analysis to happen inside the agencies, not to be rested as a burden on applicants so much, which is a nice thought. But there are some criticisms that are being made of this process, and they're being given a strong airing in the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, which is the criticism that this whole the broader Biden push on reforming how regulation is done and assessed, but this change in particular to target welfare rather than efficiency is politicising what has previously been a bipartisan, broadly respected, adhered to process, and it's all going to end in tears and just be reversed by the next administration because it's all bound up in politics now.
But, cost-benefit analysis itself, like the idea that you would take that strongly sort of, you can call it neoliberal if you want, a strongly utilitarian perspective on it, right? That is actually a political position. It is already politicised.
But the people, good people at the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis appear to believe that they arose on a oyster shell out of the ocean, surrounded by a foam of value-free purity,
with a lotus coming from their navel.
Yes.
I presume they thoroughly weighed the costs and benefits of wading into a massive debate over this, did they?
Sick burn.
So I just want to make sure we've covered exactly what they're proposing to do. So they're this A94 fresh new hotness says there's two broad ways that one can integrate these considerations into the analysis. There's weighting, so you can just load up the benefits with a multiplier for poorer communities and potentially downweight the benefits to wealthier communities. But there's another option. Averaging. So you can income average across a whole population, which has some similarities to the way that we approach the value of a statistical life.
Yes, which is really quite averaging is quite a good thing there. Arguing for a non-averaging approach involves some quite gruesome value judgments. Like, it's all value judgments. There's no escaping value judgments here. But like as a matter of pure economic efficiency maximization, a person who is earning $1 million a year as a high-powered executive something or other and is struck by a car and unable to work afterwards has been associated with the loss of far more dollars than a person who is unable to work in any capacity and is then struck by a car and loses their future non-earning capacity. And if you put a completely differentiated value on the two lives, then that leads you in the direction of some unpleasant conclusions around, we want to protect people who are economically valuable and we're not so much fussed about people who aren't. The averaging approach that is taken in the US and effectively in many other places is to say we're going to come up with one value for a human life. Maybe we'll differentiate it a bit by age and how much life is left to a person. But we're not going to differentiate it much, and then we're going to take measures that make sense for that average value. And what they're saying in this paper is, well, if it's a bit hard to do the weighting thing, then maybe we can just take some averages and average out the value of houses, for instance. That also can produce some weirdness. You might find yourself, for instance, taking measures that actually impose some costs on homeowners that would be inappropriate or unbearable for people with in low-value housing areas. So there's a tricky choice to be made between those tools, but weighting versus averaging, it's both options available to agencies using this new circular. Actually, there's another problem there, which is that it's all optional. So it's a bit choose your own adventure, isn't it?
Yeah. And
maybe agencies facing trenchant criticism from the pulpit of the Society for BCA will say, I think I'd rather just do it the way I've always been doing it, which is exactly how US agency officials talk.
But in an American accent.
No. They're all cheeky cockneys.
I mean,
like goblins from one of Tennant's D&D campaigns.
That's right.
blimey, governor. So just on that point, though, I think some of that flexibility, if you were thinking about this in the context of, like, these guys are from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if you were thinking about this in terms of climate adaptation, you do want to have that flexibility around where you draw the boundary. Because if you were doing flood mitigation, for example, the best boundary to use is probably a catchment area.
Yep.
Right. It's not a postcode because a postcode is nothing to do with where the river doesn't respect the postcode.
Bloody rivers. No respect for anything.
No respect
Not
for
even
anything.
postcodes.
Not even postcodes. Whereas if you were doing fire, a catchment area is completely irrelevant. And it's something else. And so you do want to have that sort of, you've got to have something in there that allows you to draw a boundary that is pertinent to the problem at hand.
Absolutely. Interesting paper. Obviously, the context is different to what we're dealing with here in Australia. What, if anything, can we take out from this paper as we reflect on our own approach to cost-benefit analysis here in Australia?
Well, one way or another, we are going to be affected big time by the regulatory judgments that are made in the US. And if they are, in fact, influenced by this approach across multiple administrations, that's going to make a difference to, among other things, how much climate mitigation the US does through regulatory action. And if it's all torn up when the second Trump administration takes office, then it won't have so much direct impact. But like everything else involved in US regulation certainly will, or non-regulation will have an impact should that dark circumstance occur. But what do you think of the odds, Alison, of us adopting any features of this directly, given that we have a different context?
I think it would be useful for the bureaucracy in Australia to think a little more explicitly about welfare, because welfare is baked in there, but because it's baked in, it's actually very hard to see a lot of the time and to see whether you are doing it right. I mean, even just things like this is coming back more to the regulatory side rather than the spending side, but if you're doing a regulation impact statement and doing your cost-benefit analysis for that, we're not consistent about how we define low-income households between different RISs, between different areas of government. You know, sometimes it's lowest quintile, sometimes it's lowest quartile, sometimes it's on income, sometimes it's on wealth, and so on. So I think we could be a little more rigorous and consistent about that, and also about saying that we're doing it, you know, actually saying the basis on which we are making these decisions. I think it's would get very interesting if it was applied to a lot of spending programs in Australia, because there are a lot of spending programs that are kind of, this is going to sound so cynical, but shut up and go away money for particularly noisy little groups around the place at particular points in time. And those programs persist for a long time. At one point, when I was in the public service, I worked on the Commonwealth's response to what was called the Williams case. That was the one around the school chaplains.
Oh, yes.
Right. There were thousands of small government grant programs that were invalidated by that decision that all had to be gone through and decided whether they were going to be kept, whether they were constitutional or not. But just the number of little funny grant programs around the place that you would look at and you would just see, you know, that this program has been running since 1984 and you just kind of like, is it still doing its thing?
And if you were able to go back into the history of them, a lot of them you would find out that they exist because the Prime Minister of the day had agreed to speak at an event and needed something to say.
Yes. I mean, that's a whole different CBA of like...
Do BCA on agreeing for the Prime Minister to speak at an event.
At an event. How much is this going to cost the budget?
Wow. That's
you only get so many outings a year. That should be in the budget papers.
Controversial.
As As always, we close out the show with one more thing where we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Alison, what have you got?
My one more thing is somewhat pertinent to today's discussion, particularly around things like floods. It's a book called A River with a City Problem. It's by Margaret Cook, and it's about the history of flooding in Brisbane. It was actually first published in 2020, but there is a new version out which has the 2021 and 2022 floods. Must suck to be her, right? Write this book and then suddenly, boom, boom, 2 big flood events in a row. But it is really interesting to kind of understand about why some of our cities are where they are, even though the fact that they're sitting on floodplains and all of the factors that have come along over the years that meant people have refused to move and have developed these sort of wishful thinking about, what's going to save them and so on. So if you're interested in climate adaptation, I would very much recommend reading this book.
I'm intrigued. You're turning me all around on this whole river issue.
All right, Tennant, what have you got?
So my one more thing is to just note the recent, as we go to the downloadable airwaves, commencement in Europe of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. CBAM is underway.
Did they invite you to the ribbon cutting for it?
Oh, they didn't. They didn't. But it's, far be it from me to completely change my position on the CBAM issue as a result of this unforgivable slight. But they have begun, but the carbon border adjustment is going to be strictly an accounting and reporting exercise for the next couple of years. There will be no bills issued to anybody except accountants until 2026-27. And then CBAM will just start phasing in. There will be a large discount at the border to reflect the fact that Europe will still be freely allocating gajillions of tonnes of emissions permits to entities in steel and cement and so forth. But it is a big step. It has, we're in the process of learning a lot about how Europe is going to administer this thing. And so even if it's just one stage in a process, it's an amazing thing that it's happened at all. And so hooray for Europe, taking a giant step forward so that we can all learn from whether they fall flat on their faces.
Well, and also as we embark on investigating the utility of a CBAM or a alternative.
Yes, we are.
Well, it's really helpful for this not to be just some esoteric concept championed by
weirdos.
I wasn't going to say it, but there you go. It is useful to have some of that real world data, albeit being sort of a shadow CBAM, as it were, that we can start to observe. And I'm hopeful that the European Union is transparent and sharing their insights that they're developing along the way. No doubt they'll be looking to make some tweaks themselves.
And even just from the way it's administered as well. So the way that the emissions trading scheme was administered in the EU was incredibly influential on how we decided to administer ours. So there's a whole lot of just sort of, learning how to govern these things, learning that happens as well.
I, however, would like to outlaw the phrase shadow CBAM and say that what Europe has...
Skabam?
No. They've got a kawaii CBAM, a baby CBAM, a little first evolution of the CBAM Pokemon.
Oh, my God.
CBambino.
Oh, brilliant, yes.
Are you trying to make the CBAM seem cute now, Tennant?
I'm merely revealing the fact that it's been cute all along. CBAM has large eyes. And a song in its heart.
Okay, all right. I'm wrapping up CBAM Corner.
What's your one more thing, Luke?
One more thing. Let's get to that. I want to highlight a speech that the AMC chair, Anna Collier, delivered to the AFR Energy Summit today as we record. It was very bullish on the role of flexible demand and consumer energy resources, which she defines really broadly. So they encompass everything from solar PV to EVs to heat pumps and consumer energy resources in the context of homes right up to larger businesses. But the reason I wanted to call it out was that she sets out a very positive vision for the role of bodies like the AMC in shaping the future of Australia's energy markets. She makes the point that, Australia is at the cutting edge globally. And she says in this speech, and I'll quote, "When I speak to international colleagues, it's clear we are miles and years ahead of their thinking with our two-way integration of CER. We are, step by step, inventing and implementing entirely new fields of policy and engineering." And Anna Collier says doing it properly might take a bit longer, but it means the changes will last. And this interested me because I have no idea if this is Anna's intention, but it read to me as a riposte to our friend Ron Ben David's critique of energy market institutions.
So this is like Notorious RBD versus Run AC. having a bit of a dance-off. It's like that.
I think she's going to bat for the role of the market institutions, and whether it's, Ben David's critique specifically or, some of the slings and arrows that are hurled in the direction of energy market bodies on the regular, she's making a strong case that, we've got this and, we might take a bit of time to get there, but we're going to get there and you'll all be glad we did it properly rather than rushing to some sort of solution that is half-baked and isn't delivering for consumers.
That's a very dramatic interpretation. From what you have read, Luke, another interpretation is Australian energy regulators say our mums think we're cool.
Anyway, so...
Oh, I just thought of one more thing.
Bonus one more thing.
Australia rejoined the Green Climate Fund.
And we didn't come empty-handed.
No, we didn't. I'm not sure we're kicking in huge amounts, but I think Penny Wong described it as modest. But we're back in helping to transfer technology to countries that don't have it.
There you go.
That's good.
That's a great one more thing.
Well done, Australia.
Our mums think we're cool.
Yeah.
All right. That is our show for today. We're on social media on all the various platforms. You can send us your comments, questions and reports to our email address, Alison.
mailbag@letmesumup.com. No.
You were doing so well.
I was doing. Listeners, please send us your feedback.
Yeah, how many pages of notes do you have on that iPad?
Yeah, but I didn't write the email address down because I thought that I could remember it.
You know what you've done, Alison? You've contributed to the phenomenon of misinformation on the internet.
I'm sorry.
There's an algorithm looking for you.
Anyway.
Mailbag@letmesumup.net for all of your feedback, including cries for Frankie to come back because she knows the email address.
All right. Tell us about our website, Tennant.
Our website at letmesumup.net is the #1 place for Let Me Sum Up related episodes of the Let Me Sum Up podcast. Let Me Sum Up.
.net.
.net.
It has been an absolute delight recording in person with both of you this evening. But for Alison Reeve and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Play me out, keyboard cat.